Well, thank you for being here. I cannot spell in Slovenian the title, so Dušan Adelu. Thank you. The sound at work. So my problem is the sound, and my problem is work. Our problem is the relation between the soul and the work. Of course, when I say soul, it's a strange metaphor for a materialist as I am. I don't speak about spiritual subjects in that book or in general. I speak about, I am interested in the relation between the human activity, which means the human ability to deal with nature, to deal with the body, to deal with the mind of the others and with our own mind, and I call this activity soul. And also I am interested in the social relation that is, in a sense, capturing and modeling the activity, the intellectual activity of human beings. This relation between activity and work has become much more complicated, or in many sense has deeply changed in the last 20, 30 years. The years of the digital revolution, of the digital transformation, and also the year of let me use a word that I don't even know if exists in the English language. It's a brutal translation from German. The years of the subsumption, the capture of our intelligence and emotionality by the machine of economic accumulation, by the capitalist machine. This is, in a sense, my subject. I will try, in not more than 45 minutes, I will try to retrace the philosophical shift, the philosophical movement, the philosophical displacements which are linked to the conceptualization of these technological and social transformation. The conceptualization that was prevailing in the previous age, let's say in the age of industrial work, was based on the idea that human beings in their relation with work are essentially obliged to renounce to their ability to think, to their ability to communicate, to exchange message and meaning, were obliged to renounce to their soul, let's say. And You remember that you don't remember. I remember that some decades ago, in the 60s and in the 70s, in the age when I was studying and beginning to understand something of our condition and history, in that age, a word was very fashionable in the philosophical circle, and it was the word of alienation. Alienation, as you know very well, means the loss, almost the sale of the intimate essence. I don't like the word essence. Let's say of the intimate activity and the intimate nature of the human being itself. Alienation was the condition of the industrial worker, who was obliged every day to go to work and to forget about himself, in a sense, because he was obliged to repeat a mechanical act of production in a mechanical relation with the machine that totally erased, totally cancelled what is properly human, what is properly what is the proper being of the man. But at the same time, you know, being every day obliged for a salary, being obliged to repeat the same sequence of actions, being obliged to deal with a machine that asks you no intelligence, no emotion, but only a physical repetition of acts. This is very bad by a certain point of view, but at the same time, it gave the industrial worker the possibility of being free in his brain. It was kind of paradox. The more you are obliged to live a repetitive mechanical condition, the less you are captured inside the machine itself. We are living a transformation that, first of all, concerns the forms of our activity, but also implies a different relation between the machine and our brain, the machine and our emotionality, the machine and language. That is the essential shift that we are living. Once upon a time, in the industrial world, alienation meant essentially forget about your soul and repeat a mechanical act. But at the same time, that gave you the possibility of being able to think, to be with yourself in those hours of mechanical work. What is happening nowadays is that our what is properly human, language, emotionality, is captured by the linguistic machine. Well, by the point of view of the history of concepts, obviously you can frame, you can try to understand and elaborate this transformation by many points of view. My personal pathway to the understanding of this transformation has been essentially shaped by some philosophical adventures that are commonly known as post-operaismo. This is the Italian definition of a special brand of Marxism which was particularly alive in the 60s and in the 70s, but has developed, deployed its potentialities also in the last decades, and also the French philosophical movement that is commonly known as post-structuralism. I try to say something about the implications and the conceptual transformation that you can find in these philosophical tendencies. Then I will try to enter more deeply in the implications of the transformation that I am talking about. The Italian experience of operaismo was, first of all, was based on the intense process of social struggles that took place in the 60s, let's say, the years around 68. Some thinkers like Mario Tronti, Romano Alquati, Toni Negri, Renato Panzieri, and others tried to change the traditional Marxist approach to the social movements with the intention of displacing the point of view from the structure of production, from the history of capital, to the subjective dimension. A sort of attempt in subjectivating the social history. In a certain sense, the operaista, that kind of workerist move was based on the idea that you cannot understand social history, you cannot understand the history of capital, you cannot understand the history of technology, particularly the history of technology, if you stay inside the technological structure itself. You can better understand this process if you try to have a look from outside, and this outside is subjectivity, is, let's say, the suffering of the subjectivity. Actually, the word suffering is not part of the Marxist or Ockereista tradition at all, but it's a good way to understand. If you start from the point of view of the alienation, by the point of view of the suffering, of the rebellion, of the perception of the intolerability of that condition of repetitivity and alienation, if you start by this point of view, you have the possibility of understanding why things change. People, the workers, the industrial workers, did refuse their condition, and this refusal, which was in a sense properly definable as refusal of work, of alienated salaried work, this refusal was producing an effect of the construction of the social organization and of the technological organization itself. Think, for instance, to the introduction of the assembly line in the 20s and in the 30s in the United States of America, and in many, and little by little in the European industrial society. Where starts, what is the starting point of the technological transformation which is implied in the shift from the individual working place to the creation of an assembly line? This transformation is essentially linked to the capitalist understanding of the political force of the professional worker, which was more and more in control of the production, of the process of production. So, capital introduced, the capitalist introduced the Taylorist, Fordist organization of work, which was aimed to break, to destroy, to fragment that kind of power of the industry, of the professional worker of the beginning of the 20th century, and so on. All the experience of the workers' movement in the first 2-3 decades of the century, the experience of the so-called concilierism, the organization of worker councils, was based on this power of the individual professional workers. So the assembly line was aimed to break this direct relation between the individual worker and the machine. But in the following decades, particularly in the 50s, in the 60s, when the assembly line became the prevailing form of organization, of technological organization of work, in the industrialized West, in large part of the industrial world, in that moment, the assembly line, which had been conceived as a tool for the destruction of the professional force of workers, turned to became something totally different. It became a sort of form of concatenation, of coordination of the workers' refusal of that kind of depersonalization and alienation which was implied in the assembly line. The assembly line, conceived to be a form of subjection of the professional force of the workers, changed its nature and became a sort of natural, technological form of coordination of the insubordination of workers. Actually, at the end of the 60s in Italy, like in France, like in Germany, and also largely in the United Kingdom, in the United States. The assembly line became a sort of place for the coordination of political subversion and of refusal of the industrial work from the by the workers. So you see, the operaista, how can I say, workerist, very ugly word that I don't have any better. It's the way I would prefer to speak of worker subjectivism in a sense. But anyway, that theoretical methodology, which was based on the on putting the worker's subjectivity at the center of the process of transformation, first of all of technological transformation. This methodology gave us the possibility to understand a long-lasting process of technological modification. But the real novelty, the novelty which is relevant, important for us nowadays, is the novelty which is implied in that historical moment that we are accustomed to call 68. What actually is 68 by the point of view of social subjectivity? What actually is 68 by the point of view of the process of destructuration and transformation, technological and political transformation of work. What is 68? In Italy, 68 it is essentially identifiable with a slogan, which is the slogan Operaie Studenti Uniti nella Lotta, workers and students united in the struggle. Rhetorical for sure, little bit kitsch, but forget about the rhetorics. Let's have a look at the deep meaning of this project of solidarity. It's not only, it's also, Italy is a Catholic country, so why not? It's also the desire to be together with the disempowered, but it's not essentially a problem of solidarity. It's much more a problem of social and intellectual convergence of two different social powers, of social potencies. One is the potencies of the refusal of work, the refusal of repeating that kind of mindless, stupid, unintelligent repetition of acts by the industrial workers. The other is the intellectual understanding that what the Germans call Techniswissenschaft, the technological and scientific intelligence can become a conscious, intentional factor of transformation of the productive system and a force of self-valorization of society at large, and particularly of workers. I mean, when I will try to be more direct, when workers started stopping the machine breaking the machine, organizing strikes in an autonomous way, and in a sense, when workers started destroying the political power of capital in the industrial factories, the boss is obliged to call the engineer. The capitalist is obliged to call the engineer and ask the engineer, please come here and do something in order to change the organization of labor in such a way that workers stop having so much power. I mean, you see, the synergy, the convergence is not only in the intentions of the movement, the convergence is in the common interest of the capitalist development and of the social subjectivity. The students are the manifestation, the social manifestation of the potency of the general intellect, of the potency of the technological and scientific intelligence, which is able to transform the organization of labor in such a way that, first of all, industrial workers can stop being industrial workers up to a point, of course. Secondly, they stop having that form of power, of sabotage and insubordination. But third, the focus of the process of valorization may shift from the repetitive and stupid act of mechanical work to the more elaborated and complex and productive act of imagining and of projecting and of thinking and of programming the new machine, which is the linguistic machine. What I'm saying actually is that 68 is not only a political act of refusal of the industrial alienation, but is also a sort of accumulation of political and intellectual force of the students who are not only students but are engineers and poets who are preparing themselves to face the new reality of changing world, of changing work. Engineers and poets. I know there are also many other intellectuals like philosophers, sociologists, and so on, and psychoanalysts. But I focus on engineers and poets because I think that in the cultural wave that starts in 68 and is still deploying under our eyes, the main problem, the main political and cultural problem is the recomposition of the general intellect, is the recomposition of the fragmented force of human intelligence. In this transformation, which is, let's be clear, is identifiable with the creation of the Internet. The Internet is essentially the technological and cultural manifestation of a process of transformation of work which displays the center, the focus of the process of valorization from the level of physical transformation of matter to the linguistic transformation of being. That is the general sense, the general vision of the process that we have been living through in the last 40 years. also. So, in this process of displacement and of restructuration of the relation between work and intelligence, in this process, one of the many things, probably the most unstable thing that is happening is the fragmentation of the intellectual potency. What do I mean? I mean that the effect of the post-industrial, let's use this word, transformation, is the separation between the force of imagination, the force of invention, of project, from the force of mechanical reproduction. A sort of mechanical reproduction is implied, is captured, is taken inside the process of the general intellect itself. I mean, let's define some figures inside the intellectual force that Marx called the general intellect. Let's define some figures. And you can see, if you agree, the figure of the poet. The poet is someone, call him the artist, also the scientist in some way, the visionary, the person who is able to imagine something in a totally free way, who has no relation with repetition, but is only interested in difference, in the imagination of something that does not belong to the present organization of reality. That is the poet. The poet is someone who is able to think and to see something that is not existing, right? Creation. Actually, the word poet is a good word to say that, because the etymology of poetry is just creating, doing, making also, but making in the sense of creation, of giving form, giving shape to something that did not exist before. Then you have a second figure which is crucial in this relation, and this other figure is the engineer. Obviously, I say the engineer, but I mean a lot of different intellectual personalities who are executing a project and who are producing things that have to be compatible with the pre-existing framework of the economic reality. Compatibility is a key word for engineering. You have to do something that is compatible with what? In order to understand what is the framework of compatibility, we need a third figure in this kind of fantastic fragmentation of the general intellect. And the third figure is the economist. Who is the economist? The economist, who is not a scientist by my point of view, I beg pardon to the economists in this room. I don't see economists here. Well, who is the economist? The economist is someone who is charged to enforce the existing law of profit, the existing law of growth, of capitalist growth, in the organization of the general intellect, in the organization of the intellectual activity of work. You know, I don't think that economics is a science. at the very end. I don't want to elaborate what the word science mean. What is science exactly? Well, first of all, science has to be a creative act of conceptual framing of an existing reality, of a reality which has to pre-exist to the intellectual act of scientific conceptualization. As far as I know, the reality that the economist is talking about does not exist before, exists after the act of economic conceptualization and of economic disciplination, organization, and so on. Well, let's say that the so-called economic science is a technology, is the activity which is aimed to force reality inside laws that pretend to be natural laws, but actually the economic growth is not a natural law. It's essentially the human decision that things have to go in that way, and we call that way growth, and so on and so on. I mean, the so-called economic laws are the formalization and enforcing of a social interest, which is the interest of a social class, well, so you see these three figures, the economist, the engineer, the poet, are by many ways can be considered a form of fantastic, not so scientific, I know, attempt to three different possibilities that have been separated one from the other. A process of recombination, of recomposition of the general intellect is essentially a project of liberation of the engineer from the economist, and at the same time is a project of alliance of the engineer with the poet. This is my personal strategy at the moment. I told you before that I want to say something, and I have been left only 10 minutes to do so. I want to say something about another philosophical school which has been relevant in the understanding of the present shift from industrial to cognitive work. And this other philosophical school is generally known as post-structuralism, or call it as you like. I prefer to say the theory of desire, or the theory of desiring subjectivation. At a certain point, after '68, essentially in the French philosophical area, the idea that if the scientific approach to reality has to be based on the individuation of structures, and the idea that this structure is modeling the activity and the life itself of the subject was rejected or questioned, at least, by philosophers like Michel Foucault, once by a certain point of view, or like Deleuze and Guattari. What is the essential move of those philosophers? And I say something about that because it has something to do with my previous description of the present transformation. What is the essential move of the post-structuralist theory of design? Essentially, it's displacing the point of view of the philosopher, but also the point of view of the activist, or the point of view of the psychoanalyst, from the attempt to reduce, I don't have the word, to force the real existence of subject inside the structural norm, the pre-existing structural form, which is the structure. The philosophical move of Deleuze and Guattari, for instance, is based on the idea that the psychoanalyst, just to name a spatial kind of activity, the psychoanalyst has not to be the person who is able to decide your relation with the norm, or your relation with the structure. The psychoanalyst is someone who is able to come with you, to walk with you in the tunnel of fear or in the sky of desire. The psychoanalyst has to be someone who is able to be as crazy as his schism, who has to be the fellow, the walker in darkness or the walker in light, who comes together with you, discovering the meanings and the possibilities of your suffering or of your desire. So, like the psychoanalyst has to stop to identify or reduce the reality of desire, of dream, of imagination with the structure and the normalcy of the ego. In the same way, the politician, the activist, the social activist has to stop to try to identify the social reality with a sort of good ideal, with a sort of right and structural organization of society, and has to start to work together with the social process of transformation and of desire. So, in a sense, the proximity of the Italian school of operaismo and of the post-structuralist French school of desiring theory of desire, the proximity between these two schools is essentially to be found in the understanding that we cannot decide as politicians, as therapists, as psychoanalysts, or as scientists. We cannot decide from outside about the social object of our attention. We are part of the problem, and we are part of the solution. We are part of the process of continuous redefinition of the general intellect. In a sense, and I'm going to my conclusion, which is not so much a conclusion. In fact, at the end, I would say that today we are living a moment a moment in which it's difficult to understand where are we going, where society is headed, and so on, especially in Europe. You know, we don't even understand what Europe is. Is Europe the project of peace and solidarity that someone had in his mind 50 years ago? Or is Europe a bank organization aimed to extract as much value as possible from the pockets of society, to impoverish society and so on? That is the problem that we face. And actually, at the moment, Europe is the second thing, clearly. When we try to understand and to decide and to start something at the social level, at the intellectual level, and so on, we are not dealing with that object that we can call the European society. We are dealing essentially with the relation between the content of our activity as content, and the semiotic frame, I would say the tangle, I would say the cage that is containing, compressing, reducing, perverting the possibilities of the content itself. I mean, we are accustomed to think to social action in terms of opposition. For 100 years, we've been accustomed to think that there is a bad guy and a good guy. We, of course, are the good guys. And the fight is between the workers and the capitalists. When this conceptualization of reality has not been very used. I mean, yes, we have done a lot of things in the last 100 years, do you remember? But not all of those things have worked well. And actually, at the moment, we have the impression that conceptual description of the process is totally out of work. If we conceive the process as a process of opposition, we are lost. There is no way, no possibility of coming out from the present abyss, from the present disgrace. I propose a different conceptual imagination of the process, which is not based on the metaphor of opposition, but is based on the metaphor of disentanglement. I see the present process as a process of entangling and disentangling. We should not try to imagine something new. That is not the problem. We should be able to organize the present, the existing force, the existing dynamics of the general intellect, which is ourselves, which is the relation between the different functions of the human intelligence, socially organized and technologically organized by the network. We should be able to think about this existing force in terms that are not entangled, not limited, not preformed and pre-organized by the semiotic form that is called capital. Well, I know it's not that easy, but it's a process which is very different from the old metaphor of fight, of struggle. What do you want to do at the level of struggle? How do you think it is possible to fight against that power? It's unwinnable. It's impossible. let's think in a different way. The problem is not to destroy or to fight. The problem is to disentangle what already exists. The problem is to redefine the relation between the engineer and the poet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the lecture, particularly because it's very clear, very precise, and it gave me some better insight into your work. And for me, I'm a little bit, let's say, involved in the discussion about presumption, this general transformation of society in terms of, it was before imagined in terms of the position between production and consumption, and now these two processes have somehow merged. So from this perspective, I can follow very much part of your argument, and then it stops because. And here is, I will just skip and come to my question. From the perspective of presumption, it looks that this relationship has already been redefined, relationship between the engineer and the poet. Because as a presumer, a person has to do both at the same time. So what do you say about it?
Well, I try to interpret the concept of prosumer, and I try to identify this concept. And what comes to my mind is the Google empire, let's say. What Google is, because the concept of prosumer was imagined, if I remember well, by people like Alvin Toffler at the beginning of the 80s. So in that moment was the prediction, the imagination of an increasing integration between the activity of the producer and the activity of the consumer. But now we have this extraordinary manifestation of the integration what actually is this the Google empire? It's essentially the ability to capture the activity of the consumer and transform this activity into a process of production that is implying the consumer himself as a producer and so on. The object of the entire process is attention, is that the human attention. Capturing the human attention, transforming the attention into a force of valorization, which is at the same time consumption and production. I don't pretend that my metaphor of the engineer and the poet is a sort of solution of all the problems. But at the same time, I think that the Google example is very interesting by this point of view, because Google is a factory where you have lots of poets working and lots of engineers working at the same time. But the general process is separating the two different activities and unifying the two different activities by the point of view of the economist. The network, the internet, should be in an utopian imagination, not so utopian. The internet could be a machine for the perfect allocation of the existing resource in function of the needs of society. It's conceived to be that. It's not acting that way. Why? Because the poet and the engineer are not working together. Because the decisional function is the function of the economist, who is impeaching to the engineer to build a poetical machine, giving to him what he needs, and he is here, and already is here. So you see, in the relation between production and consumption, the separation of the visionary from the executional or executive, I don't know, this separation is really explaining a lot of things, at least.
May I add something to this very interesting discussion? Also from my side, congratulations for this very interesting lecture. I was thinking during your explanation now, I was thinking about these two categories of consumption and production. Don't you think, in connection to the internet, let's say, Google you mentioned as an example, don't you think that also in old media, like television or journals, newspapers, and blah blah, we had, structurally speaking, not in detail, but just taking it as its general shape. Don't you think that we had also a situation where consumers were at the same time also producers? Because we had all the time people coming to the television studios to speak, intellectuals, also economists, engineers, poets, everybody, being invited by the media to come to share their thoughts with other people. Also, opinion pools on the streets with so-called ordinary people in the factories everywhere. So they were all somehow involved in that specific mode of production of the mass media, although in a rather traditional way. I agree, the traditional way, but in a sense, it was also kind of involvement of consumers into the process of production. My thinking about the situation you described, also with this figures. You express that you are talking about metaphors, okay? That's important, I think, to take into account. But on the other hand, your metaphors of these three figures are still kind of professions. What about their position in the very organization of production or of social reality? What about their position? About their structural position in the organization of work or production? I think that's important because still, we have this relation which is conflictual by definition between capital and the labor. Which you said that maybe it is circulus virtuosus, and we should somehow find another way to think about it, is still present. I mean, we cannot abandon it. I mean, that's basic conflict also in today's society. I strongly believe in it. So what do you think about it? Are you really think that we can step out of this visual circle with the concept of disentanglement and the reorganization of the existing.
I beg your pardon if I gave way to such a misunderstanding. It's obviously my fault. I do not think that I don't want to use the word contradiction because it's too loaded, but let's say the opposition of economic and social interests is the basic reason of the entanglement itself. Why the general intellect is unable to do what it could do? Why are we unable to use our intelligence in order to make people to avoid war and to have what is possible to have, because the scarcity is an effect of production. So why does it happen? It happens because you are totally right. Capitalists are holding an economic power which gives them the possibility of being the power, and so what I propose is not a sort of abandonment of the consciousness of a social opposition of the economic interests. What I propose is a different pathway for the overcoming of this condition. If the pathway is based on the idea of a power against another power, we are already lost. We have already lost every possibility, and also it's not explaining the richness of the present condition. It's I understand that at the beginning of the 20th century, the political force of industrial workers was aimed to create the conditions for universal prosperity. Now the conditions for universal prosperity are there. We have produced reality. The problem is, how can we disentangle that possibility? That disentanglement needs a political strategy and probably also the political expression of antagonism. But the pathway is not antagonism. The pathway is, no, it's not a problem of pathway. We have to be conscious of the fact that we are not claiming for something that has to come. We are simply demanding the whole implementation, realization, deployment of something that is already here. It's a sort, if you want, it's an exorcism against my own pessimism. I am totally pessimist when I think in political terms. I see that there is no way out from the present situation. And I become totally optimist when I look at what already exists. I speak with people, I use technologies that are giving me the possibility of living well, me and the others, and 7 billion people in the planet. The problem is that the organization, for instance, distribution of wealth, distribution of technological resources, access to education, and so on, we know very well the list. The problem is to give life to something that is already there. Then I want to say just words about the first part of what you said, because it's my preferred subject. The shift from the media, which were essentially separating the producer from the consumer, to media that are more and more implying the producer and the consumer, up to the point that you cannot distinguish one from the other. Actually, I've been marked in my personal experience by the experience of the free radios in the 70s. And if you if you think what the free radios have been in that period, you see that it's a sort of passage from the old conception of broadcast, of what McLuhan defines as the centralized medium of television, to the internet. From the centralized television to the internet, you can situate some experiences like the free radios, but not only that, which are trying to mix. The free radio is based more than on the transmitter is based on the telephone. The essential tool of the free radio is the telephone, because people can call from their house and enter into the transmitter. You see, it's already an attempt to go beyond the separation, the broadcast separation, and it's already a sort of prefiguration of what the internet is in full swing. Yeah.
Good morning. I am an economist.
But I beg your pardon.
A student of economics. And, okay. Studying it, I also feel like economics needed to be freed from the engineering approach, from the engineer, and to be reconnected, unified with the poet and the creation of something new or a different kind of thought. And my question is, what was the role of university in this fragmentation of the general internet? And what might be its role in the reunification of the engineer and the poet, and maybe also the economist?
Thank you. Thank you, because you give me the possibility of saying something more, but saying something essential about the actual history of the general intellect. As you know, also Marx could be defined as an economist. Actually, he said, I am a critical of the economic policy. So, just to say that I think in my utopia of recomposition, the economist is necessary. I don't want to fire the economists from my work. I want them as part of the process. So the history of the university and the place, the role that university has been playing and is playing actually is a crucial point in order to give a possible, to make understandable this idea of recomposition of the general intellect. First of all, what the university actually is. If we think, I come from Bologna, so I am an expert in this field. So, at the beginning, the university, the institution, called the university, I don't teach at the University of Bologna, but I have my head full of the rhetorics about the university. The creation of that institution is based, one, on the free relation between clerici vagantes, among people who come from different places of the world and meet somewhere in a nomadic way in order to exchange knowledge first. Second, the creation of university is narrowly linked with the disentanglement of knowledge from the dogma, which in that time was the dogma of theocracy. So, the progressive role of the university in the 9 centuries of its existence, the 9 centuries of modernity, or the creation of modernity, the main role has been the role of free in the sense of non-dogmatic production of knowledge. It's so obvious that I am almost ashamed to say that. Everybody knows, but something happens at the end of the past century. And what happens essentially is the reinstitution of the dogma. The dogma comes back. And, the dogma is no more the theological dogma, but is the economic dogma. And the economic dogma is, first of all, institutional, political, structural. Secondly, epistemological. First of all, you know what the Bologna Chart is. In the year 1999, in the city where the freedom of university has been conceived 9 centuries ago, the freedom of university is killed and abolished with an act which is the signature of the Bologna Chart by the ministries of the education of Europe, and the Bologna Chart is based on the concept, the tricky and paradoxical and self-disclaiming concept of autonomy of the university. What is the autonomy of the university? Is the fact that the university will no more be financed by the public powers, will no more be financed by the state. The university is free. Free means that you have to look for the money. And how can I look for the money? The only way is going to someone who has money in his pockets and gives me the money in order to teach and study and be a university, which is expensive, as you know. The history of the last 10-15 years has been, beyond many other things, has been the history of the destruction of the autonomy of the university for the sake of the autonomy of the fake autonomy of the university. Actually, the principle of fake autonomy is based on the idea that the knowledge activity is accepted, is institutionalized, if it is rentable. The relation between the intellectual activity of the university people and their economic outcome is considered as the real foundation of the existence of the university, up to the point that in the United Kingdom nowadays they are totally cancelling financement for the humanities, the so-called humanities. Why? Because if people want to study literature, well, they can do it, but they have to pay. So, as the reading Shakespeare is not rentable at the level of the market, if you want to study Shakespeare, you have to pay for it. This is you see, this is an institutional, structural, political destruction of the freedom, of the autonomy of the university. Not only this, it's also an epistemological act. It's the epistemological act consisting in the affirmation that there is a universal value concerning medicine, engineering, literature, chemics, and philosophy, and everything, and this universal criterion, call him God, is the economic rentability. If it is rentable, it is true. If it is not rentable, it is not true. So I don't finance you. You see, so this is, you pardon me for the aggressiveness, but it's my subject. It's what I want to talk about at the moment. In the year 2009, 2010, a movement against the so-called autonomy, the fake autonomy, started in the United Kingdom, in London. And London has been a very interesting city in the period for 2010-2011. And now it's boring as always, but for a period it was interesting. And what was a movement of students, researchers, teachers was in the streets. They occupied banks, they organized teach-ins in the banks, and in that moment I was very much working in London in that period, and with some London friends, especially of the Goldsmith Academy and some other institutions like that, we started the project called SHEPSI, that means European School for Social Imagination. And our idea was essentially to fight against the epistemological domination of the economy, of economics and the economy in the general process of knowledge. Actually, the project of SHEPSI has been active for 2 years. We were expecting, frankly speaking, we were expecting a wide movement of occupation of the university. It has not happened. And in my opinion, this is the real defeat of Occupy. The movement of Occupy has essentially been defeated by our inability to occupy the university and to transform the university into a place of autonomy, of real autonomy, like in the 12th century in Bologna. Perfect. 10:05. It has been a pleasure.
Well, thank you.